Okay, hello everybody. This is Gary Barnes, and welcome to today's webinar on team building. I'm going to give a couple of minutes for people to come in. We've got 69 people so far, and the numbers are adding up. And I'm testing the slide. Hopefully everybody can see the slides and can hear me. If you can't see or hear me, you can't see me, but you can see the slides and you can hear me, and all of you are on mute, so I can't hear anybody else. So if you have questions, use the questions tab on your screen, and Brenda is with me to help with logistics. Okay.
So it looks like the participants can see you and hear you.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get going then. So we will run for somewhere between 45 and 50 minutes, and then leave room for questions. So here we go. All right. So who I am, I'm Gary Barnes. I have worked in the field for a little over 30 years. I've done this training before, and variations of it. I've worked with small groups, large groups, worked with coworker conflicts, and so have, I think, a fair amount of experience building a coherent and functional team. Can be challenging, it can be rewarding, and there's a lot of aspects to it. We'll cover some of those aspects today. And then I'm not sure who you are. I'm going to ask that question in just a second. And what are we going to do today? We're going to cover, like I said, some aspects of what it means to build a healthy team, what a healthy team looks like, and how, and some of the most important factors. I use a model based on a guy named Patrick Lencioni, and it's called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. He has written several books, and they tend to have negative titles, I think, to draw you in, but the book and the model is anything but negative, I think. I think it's positive and helpful and simple. It's a way to understand how to build a team sort of from the bottom up. So some of you may be familiar with his work, and you'll see that laced throughout this. I use other material as well, and also my own experience. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so here's our first polling question, and if you haven't participated in a webinar before, you get a chance to vote on your answer to this question. So what I wanted to know is, are you a team leader, supervisor, or manager in kind of a position of power in a team or with other people, or are you part of a work team but not in a leadership position? So answer that question now. We'll give you a minute or two to answer. I want to know what I'm dealing with, basically. All right. Did you close it, Brenda?
I did, yes.
Yeah. All right. So 71%, 71% say that you are a team leader, supervisor, or manager. That's fantastic. 33% of you are part of a work team, and that leave some percentage who didn't know how they wanted to answer or something like that, which is fine. So more managers, supervisors, etc. So this is excellent. The reason I asked that question is because really being a leader is important. If you're not a leader, sometimes you don't have enough power to be able to make changes to improve your team. You can improve yourself, you can make suggestions to others, and you'll find a lot of stuff. For those of you who are not leaders, you will definitely get information in this training that will be helpful to you. But probably more of it is helpful to leaders. Okay, so our goals are to provide some of the qualities of a well-functioning team and what gets in the way, discuss some of the common issues that get in the way and some ideas for improving, and provide some skills for managing interpersonal conflict, given that interpersonal conflict is one of the key things that gets in the way of building a functional team. So we start with this question: what is a team? And do you even have one? And because I can't talk to you and know who each of you are, you could be in very different settings. You could be part of a small work team. You could be part of a leadership team in a large organization or a small organization. You could be part of a team that communicates with each other remotely and don't see each other every day. You may not even think of yourself as part of a team. A good way to think of a team, I think, is through a sports analogy. So if you take any kind of a team, like a football team or a basketball team, what are some of the things that tell you that they're a team? Well, they have the same uniform, so they know that they're on the same team. They have an opponent in a different uniform. And so they clearly know what it is that they're up against. And then each team member presumably has a role. Like if you're in basketball, you have forwards and centers and shooting guards and passing guards and people more oriented to defense, and all of that's decided ahead of time. So each person on a well-functioning sports team would have a pretty well-defined idea of what their contribution to the team is. And then another factor of a sports team is a scoreboard. You can sort of actively keep track in the moment of how you're doing. Are you winning? You know, you can see individual statistics, but really individual statistics aren't as important as whether your team is doing well. So in a perfect world, we could create work teams that mirrored sports teams in those ways, meaning you clearly knew physically, perhaps, who your team is. So you're constantly reminded of who your team is. You have a pretty well-defined opponent, or in some cases, it's not an opponent, but it's a goal or a purpose for being. And then you have a scoreboard that keeps track of team outcomes over and above individual ones. Okay, so what are some of the challenges for teams? And I'll go through these relatively quickly because I like to try to be oriented to positive things more than negative. But sometimes we don't understand the team concept. Goals are not clearly defined. So what is our purpose? Trust gets damaged. And so dialogue, and we'll even define, before this training is over, we'll define what we mean by the word dialogue. Process can be sabotaged by individuals or subgroups in order to keep things from moving forward out of a personal need game or like that. There's more expectations for around realistic for the group. And there are, I won't have time to get into this much today, but there's a 4-step process for understanding how a team develops. Forming, storming, norming, and performing is the way we describe it. So when a team first gets together, we don't believe that they start right off performing at a high level. And they first come together, and then there's a period that we call storming, which means usually some conflict or reorientation to help people pull themselves together. And then out of that, there gets created some group norms, and then we start performing. So sometimes teams are impatient and don't recognize the stage of team development they're in. Sometimes management doesn't support a team in terms of resources, knowledge, lending experience, and training resources that might be necessary. You don't get funded for these nice team retreats at resort hotels or remote islands or whatever. So you're just too busy to really put the effort into the team itself. And then different schedules, different locations. This is obviously much more of an issue today with people working remotely. They don't see each other, so they don't have the same level of relationships. Schedules are different. Often a lot of organizations, especially organizations, are trying to respond to customers more hours during the day, which means people work different hours, so they don't even get to see each other. So pulling together and knowing that you're part of the same team working toward the same goal becomes more challenging. Of course, you don't have to choose your coworkers. So sometimes you get paired with people who you're not naturally inclined to get along with. Some people may be more organized and think ahead, and other people are more seat of the pants oriented, different ways of dealing with conflict, that kind of thing. That creates challenges. But of course, this diversity, when harnessed, can also be the greatest strength of a team. So in a team, you will have complementary skills and experience, trust each other, you're committed to a common purpose. You hold yourselves mutually accountable, it's very, and committed to working together to achieve high performance. Often we get focused on individual performance and individual goals at the exclusion of team performance. Okay, so I told you we're going to do the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and this is the pyramid that Patrick Lencioni, and there's a lot of free information available from their website. This, for example, came from their website. The book is really nice. There's a workbook as well. The book is nice because he tells parables. So his books are always a story about him. In this case, it's about a woman who is called in to pull together a work team and sort of get involved, pulled into the drama of the story, and so it's a painless way of learning about some ideas of a team. So as you can see in this model, the 5 dysfunctions are on your left, and then the functions, I suppose, are on the right. And specifically, and this is speaking to the 70% of you who are in this training, these are the roles of the leader. So the absence of trust, and we're going to go through these. The absence of trust is at the bottom of the pyramid because if you don't have trust, then you can't have the things that fall on top of it. So the next thing is conflict, fear of conflict, and a lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and a lack of attention to results. So at the bottom of the pyramid, if we now go to the right, the goal is vulnerability. So in his model, the sort of the opposite of the absence of trust, or the way you build trust, is through being vulnerable, admitting mistakes, sharing a mild to moderate degree of personal information about yourself, your own challenges, not personally as much as professionally. And then in conflict, he has a term that he calls unfiltered debate. So the second level is actually very important, I find. It's the willingness to engage in a productive kind of conflict, which then leads to really healthy and robust discussions, which can then lead to commitment. But somebody has to force clarity and closure. So you do things like agree to disagree, or you I think his term is disagree and commit. So you agree to try something for a period of time and then come back and review how it's working. And that leads to commitment. And then, of course, holding each other accountable, confronting issues as they come along, and then the results part is focusing on collective outcomes. Okay, so then a well-functioning team, if we positive, trust team members, has unfiltered debate, commits to decisions and plans of actions. Even if you don't agree with it, you commit to it, and you hold each other accountable and focus on the achievement of results. So let's start with trust. The fear of being vulnerable with team members prevents the building of trust within a team. And this can happen very quickly. You feel hurt or shut down and then just go away. And we have implicit learning from childhood and from previous workplaces and previous relationships that kick in, and we just sort of do what we do. So if it's feeling unsafe, you don't really think about it. You just do whatever you do when things feel unsafe. So what are some of the causes of mistrust? Unresolved issues from the past, and this can be in an organization, or it can be literally an individual could have unresolved issues from their past that could be interfering with team trust. The lack of relationships. So just again, that back to that forming, storming, and performing idea. Sometimes you just don't know each other well enough or get to spend enough time together. And we were talking about remote teams, and that can be particularly challenging. There is benefit to having what we call small talk. Too much of it, of course, then you're in the category of goofing off. But a little bit of water cooler conversation helps to build relationship. Personality characteristics can clash, and this can cause problems. Conflict may not be managed very well. I've had many examples of where leaders step in inappropriately to try to manage conflict. And it's very similar to parenting, really. If your kids are with each other and you step in and you tell, one of your children, to stop misbehaving, then you're sort of siding with the other child, and it's sort of a no-win proposition there. And you're certainly not creating a trusting situation. So that happens a fair amount, and it's a challenge as a leader. You know, when are you responsible for managing the poor behavior or inappropriate behavior of one of your team members, and when are they really responsible for managing it between themselves? And then unmanaged transition. So there is almost always there is more work to be done when organizations go through change, which last time I checked is pretty much constant. And so if people haven't adjusted to changes, haven't embraced changes, haven't agreed to changes, this could be loss of key staff, it could be more demands, it could be new software, all kinds of things, if not managed well, can create people digging trenches and hiding out from the rest of their team. And lack of first rules of respect. So I do like the idea that you can have a discussion as a team, should have a discussion as a team about what are our civility rules, is one way to think about it. And you can have a really nice discussion about what are our rules for respect and civility. And I can't ask you this question because I can't hear you, but what of these things are happening on your team? Okay, so in terms of building relationship, we borrow this from the marital research, the work of John Gottman. I believe John Gottman is the one who coined the term emotional bank account, although it's used not just in marriage, but it's used in the workplace, it's used in schools. And the idea is to have a 5-to-1 ratio of positives to negatives. And if a relationship, you have at least 5 positives to negatives overall in the bank account, you're going to view that relationship in a positive way. You're going to be less reactive. You're going to tip toward the positive, give your coworker the benefit of the doubt. If, for example, I stick my foot in my mouth, but I have a good, healthy, emotional bank account balance with the worker, they'll forgive me much faster for sticking my foot in my mouth. So this is sort of works as insulation in relationships. We have more control over the positives, less control over the negatives. Negatives just tend to happen. I just mentioned the idea of sticking my foot in my mouth. I usually don't plan to stick my foot in my mouth to say something or offensive or that upsets somebody. But unfortunately, that sometimes happens. And so by focusing on the positives, hopefully that helps the relationship. So this includes compliments, appreciation. You can never, I don't think, show enough appreciation for each other. A map of each other's worlds. This is like an internal map where you know something about your coworkers and how they function and what they like and don't like, what they're good at, what they're not good at. And then just shared experiences, projects, meals, really helps build that positive ratio. And then accepting influence is the idea. We consider this a positive as well. It's the idea of listening to somebody else. Let them take the lead. Let them make a suggestion and you do what they say. It makes them feel like you're receptive and will be open to listening to them in the future, which builds trust. Okay. So I didn't say this yet, but we associate this with less flooding. We associate a positive emotional bank account with less flooding. And I think you could probably imagine, most people can, what flooding means. Flooding means it's sort of a physiological sensation that we have when we get upset. Our heart rate goes up quite a bit. We feel a surge of adrenaline and cortisol, depending on how upset we're getting. You get hot, flushed. Your logical brain tends to go offline. So that's flooding is, and that's not good. There's aren't really many productive conversations that happen when somebody, one or more people, one or both people are flooding. Okay, so with an absence of trust, you could conceal weaknesses and mistakes, hesitate to ask or offer help or feedback, jump to conclusions, hold grudges, and dread meetings. And why do you dread meetings? Because in meetings, people are usually more silent, and or there's a underlying hostility that happens. So meetings are a good way of judging how well your team is functioning. In contrast, when you're trusting, you admit weaknesses and mistakes to each other. You ask for help when you need it. You accept questions and input about your areas of responsibility. You give each other the benefit of the doubt before arriving at a negative conclusion, and you take risks in offering feedback and assistance. So trust is the foundation of teamwork. Trust is about vulnerability, which is difficult for us. Building trust takes time, and like a good marriage, it's never complete. It has to be maintained over time. So there are, I didn't think so. I have no slides about how to build trust other than the emotional bank account. But there are many trust building exercises that team can do. You can depending on who your team is, you can have a variety of exercises for sharing, like name one thing that you think you're good at and not so good at, is an example of a trust building exercise. There are many trust building exercises. Lencioni has them in the 5 Dysfunctions. I think it's his workbook, not the main book. Remember, there are 2 books, the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and then 5 Dysfunctions Workbook. He has trust building exercises. You'll find them in many, many management leadership books. Okay, so if you have trust, then you're in a position to deal with conflict in a healthier way. So the fear of conflict is when we try to serve artificial harmony, and it stifles productive ideological conflict. So if it's one thing that I change your mind about today, it would be, what I'd like to change your mind about is that conflict is negative. We want a certain kind of conflict. We want people to have disagreements, because in seeing things from different perspectives, that's how we get a full picture of what's going on. And many decisions that are made by teams and by organizations that don't work out so well often don't work out well because there wasn't enough disparate views being presented at the get-go. So politics is when people choose their words and actions based on how they want others to react, rather than they really think. So we don't want political conversations, people positioning what they say to gain favor or to gain more influence or whatever. Of course, these things are going to go on to some extent, but more, we want people to really consider what they think about a particular thing. You can assess whether your team has a fear of conflict by how exciting the meetings are. where there are back channel politics and personal attacks. Controversial topics are avoided rather than just named and laid out. And posturing and interpersonal problems dominate. So when you engage in healthy conflict, you have lively, more interesting meetings. You extract and exploit the ideas of all team members. You solve real problems more quickly, minimize politics, and put critical topics on the table for discussion. So obviously the challenge in conflict is what's the difference between healthy and unhealthy. So for leaders, you want to allow and encourage debate, so much so that you even mind for conflict. So if there doesn't seem to be enough discussion about a particular topic or idea, you may even ask for more. You might notice that somebody looks like they have something to say, and you try to get them to say it. And you encourage people by giving them real-time permission, like, thanks for sharing that. Now, this means, of course, that conversations sometimes will take longer, and as we'll talk about when we talk about the next section about committing, you have to eventually close debate and make decisions. But I think a strong leader recognizes that a robust discussion at an early stage before you've made a decision about how you're going to proceed can really pay off in down the road. So you save time down the road by allowing more time for discussion early on. And you don't want to do this with everything, right? I mean, you don't want to, like, where are we going to have this year's picnic? If you're spending, 3 or 4 team meetings talking about that, that's probably too much. But whether your company goes in a particular direction or not, releases a new product or a new service, those things need obviously a lot more conversation. All right. And then this model here, because some conflict is not healthy and doesn't feel healthy and doesn't feel good. And that's when conflict becomes more personal, when there is more emotion involved. And so I give you this model, and this is another book, a couple of books. It's called Crucial Conversations. Probably many of you have heard of it. It's probably maybe 10 years old now. I don't know. They wrote a second book, Crucial Confrontations, which actually I liked better. I thought it was more practical in terms of how to manage conflict. But this is just one model of many. You may have your own favorite model. But the idea here is, the whole idea of crucial conversations is that there are things that need to be talked about. And there are some things that probably don't need to be talked about. But the crucial conversation idea is that there are things that need to be talked about. The classic example that they use in the beginning of their book is of airplane disasters, and that by analyzing flight data recorders, they learned that the primary problem with airplane disasters was that the co-pilot and the pilot were not communicating, because the pilot held rank and the co-pilot didn't want to tell the pilot about something that was wrong, like, wow, there's ice on the wings. And this is a true story. There's ice on the wings, and the co-pilot is sort of hinting at it, but not really telling the pilot, and then they take off, and because of the icy wings, the plane crashes. So they've done a lot of work in the airline industry and really reduced the incidence of airline disasters simply by improving the communication so that people are willing to have tough conversation. So in this model, you can see there are two sides, the left and the right. I won't have time to really give this justice, but um, the progression from the outside to the inside. So in conflict, if we start on the me side, on the left side, and it says see and hear, tell a story, feel, and act. So those are the 4 steps toward how conflict happens. And it's also the 4 steps for how conflict can be resolved. So step 1, you see and hear something. Something happens. A coworker makes a statement, or they don't include you in a critical email, something like that. And then you tell a story about what happened. Oh, they didn't include me in that email because they don't want me to know, because if I know, then I'll have more power and I'll be included, and they want to work directly with the boss and not include me. So I tell that story, which leads me to feel angry, maybe hurt, but more probably angry, resentful, and then I act. I may act by not saying anything and just withdrawing, or I might take some aggressive step to insert myself in the conversation. Now, if we back up and we say, okay, let's redo that. So the same thing happens. I don't get included on a critical email. I tell a story to myself and I say, oh, my coworker didn't include me on that email. Possibly they just forgot. So I feel not really much at all other than, maybe curiosity. Why did it leave me out of that? And so then my action might be simply to ask my coworker, why did did you mean to include me on that email? Was there a reason that you didn't? And then I'll get a response from my coworker based on that. So the critical juncture here is the telling a story. And so we call this dialogue. Dialogue is when you create the pool of shared meaning in the middle. And then under stress, we tend to go toward, and you can see it in this model, it's at the edges of the circle, silence and violence. So when conflict erupts, we tend to go to one of those extremes, and what we're looking for is dialogue, where we can have shared meaning, where we can have a more constructive conversation. Okay, so retracing your path is what I just showed you, so I'm just going to back up again. Retracing your path is looking at this arrow in reverse. How did I get to where I got? So retracing so my actions, why am I acting this way? Because I'm feeling something. What was I feeling? Oh, well, what was the story I was feeling that led to the feeling? So again, the story is the critical piece of how you change the way you address conflict with a coworker. So emotion is helpful and we want it, but emotion gets in the way if there's too much of it. And we talked earlier about the idea of emotional flooding, and emotional flooding is a state of being where you're not going to be able to have productive conversations. So if you are flooded, you want to remind yourself you have time to resolve the conflict. You can step away in order to calm down and plan how you want to respond. And in conflict management circles, stepping away from a conflict is actually a higher level skill. So it's not the same as avoiding. Avoiding means you withdraw and you never come back to it. Stepping away to calm yourself down and think about how you want to respond is a very healthy thing to do when you're feeling a lot of emotion. And then you want to look at the story you're telling about the situation and try to tell a different story so that you can then go back to the person and address the conflict in a healthier, more constructive way. All right, so good conflict among team members requires trust, which is all about engaging in unfiltered, passionate debate. Even among the best teams, it will be uncomfortable. I think we all agree on that. Conflict by its very nature is not comfortable. Conflict norms or ground rules are healthy and good. And the fear of occasional personal conflict is often what gets in the way. Okay, so here's a question for you just to see if people are still paying attention and also see what kind of answers we get. You are really upset by something another team member said to you. A good choice would be to, number one, walk away, give yourself time to think about what to do. Don't walk away, stay and try to talk it out, or report it to your supervisor. So take a minute and answer this question. All righty. We're getting pretty strong responses. It's still going. The numbers are changing a little bit. Okay. So based on what I just said, for those of you who agreed with me, 82% of you said it's good to walk away and give yourself time to think about what to do. And the key there is you're really upset. So if you're really upset, walking away gives yourself time to think about what to do. And by the way, one of the things you could do is report it to your supervisor. So you do have that option. 22% of you said stay and try to talk it out, which depends on how upset you are and how well you deal with that. That might be an okay thing to do, but can be dangerous if you're too emotionally flooded or the other person is too emotionally flooded. And reporting it to your supervisor, and keep in mind most of you are supervisors or managers, can be appropriate in some cases if somebody's really violated a company rule in some big way. But most of the time, conflict is best dealt with one-on-one. And the role of a supervisor becomes more one of a witness or a mediator, if necessary. And I'm not sure if I have more slides on that or not. I may not, so let me just state that right now, that if you have two coworkers in conflict, what I would encourage you to consider first is the possibility of the coworkers resolving it themselves. And if they can't resolve themselves, you can offer to be present while they resolve it. So you sit with them while they talk through the conflict. And that prevents that problem we were talking about earlier, where you side accidentally with one person over the other. And it just creates a lot of mistrust. I had a case, I spend most of my day seeing clients, and I had a case of a professional who had that happen. A coworker reported him for saying something, I don't even remember what it was, but it wasn't really anything that significant. It wasn't violating a big company rule or anything like that. Well, the manager chose to deal with it by calling my client in and saying, your coworker reported that you said this, 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 and this. And not only did it not help to resolve the conflict with the coworker, but it made my client feel a lot of anger and resentment and mistrust for the leadership of the organization as a result. So sometimes you have to confront an employee about their behavior, but try to make that your second best, at least second best. Okay. All right. So the third level of building a team is commitment. So a lack of commitment means a lack of clarity, fear of being wrong, need for certainty that prevents teams from making decisions in a timely way. Oh, we're rapidly running out of time, so let me run through this. So creating commitment means adopting a disagree and commit mentality, making sure all team members are committed regardless. And so you can imagine then we have trust, then we have open dialogue or unfiltered debate, and then once everything's out, then you say, okay, we have to make a decision. This is the decision we're going to make, and we can come back to review whether that was the right decision. So you're sort of acknowledging in a lot of cases that the decisions you make may or may not be the right decision, but you have to make a decision and you all have to commit to it to see if it's going to work. All right, so leaders have to be comfortable with the prospect of making a decision that ultimately turns out to be wrong. Push the group for closure because we don't have a lot of time, and consensus is usually not obtainable. Okay, so healthy meetings. I'm going to have to skip this for the most part. I've already talked about how the signs of a unhealthy meeting is when it's more boring or silent or even worse, hostile. And then you want meetings to have a specific purpose. I'll send you, our slides will be available for you to help you with that. Okay, so then we get to the next level, which is accountability. And what we're looking for in accountability is peer-to-peer accountability, if possible. So this is a team that avoids accountability, a team that holds one another accountable, ensures that poor performers feel the pressure to improve, identify potential problems quickly by questioning one another's approaches without hesitation, establish respect among team members who are held to the same standards, and we avoid excessive bureaucracy around performance management and correct. So your complaints to you about the data so that you can talk to the other team member, ask the complaining team member to deal with it directly, tell them it's not your job to resolve conflicts for others. So which of these do you think is the best option? I've only given you 3, so you might prefer to have and now my screen is back at least. So the answer I'm looking for is number 2. It's the complaining team member to deal with it directly. And like I said, if they're uncomfortable with dealing with it directly, you can offer to help. So the third thing, telling them it's not your job to resolve the conflict, is also not an answer that I think is probably the most helpful. Because it is your job to help resolve conflicts, but it's you know, it's just not a lousy thing to say. You're like leaving them hanging by telling them it's not your job to resolve conflicts. Okay, anyway, so embracing accountability means ideally it's happening among peers, and as a leader you have to demonstrate a willingness to confront difficult issues. The best opportunity for holding one another accountable can occur during meetings, and that's Lencioni. I don't know if that's always the case or not. You don't want to call somebody out in a meeting and embarrass them. Okay, so then the top of the pyramid is collective outcomes, having some kind of a scoreboard. So I'd like you to consider, what is my scoreboard? If I were keeping score of how we're doing, what would those things look like? And then review progress on those regularly. Reward individuals based on team goals where possible. Okay. All right, so we're at the end of our training. Just a review of the EAP benefits that you have. I put these up here. If any of you need more information, remember, if you're on this webinar, you probably have our employee assistance program, and you have counseling available to you. As a supervisor, you can either go face-to-face for consultation, or you can call us and consult with a clinical person who's trained in workplace management if you want to talk about a particular team problem or a problem you're having with an employee. And then, of course, our website is myrbh.com. Okay, we're going to stop and take any questions. And let me see if I can get to those. Brenda, you might need to read them to me. I often have trouble seeing all the questions.
Okay.
So does anybody have any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions at this time, but let's give people a few minutes.
Okay. I know I rushed through the end of the training. Sorry about that. I hope it's often hard to time it exactly right. But I think you got most of the good stuff. Okay. Still no questions?
Still no questions.
No questions. Okay.
Oh, here we go. What was the name of the book at the beginning of the presentation?
The book was called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by a guy named Patrick Lencioni. And it's about 8 years old, maybe something like that. So he's written a couple of books since then. But in my mind, it was a classic. It really helped me to sort of put together how all the things that I know about a well-functioning team work. All right, I see. Is this webinar recorded? I saw that. The answer to that is yes, and it will be available on the RBH website, right?
Yes,
right, Brenda?
we're posting it to, yes, the RBH website, and then on the YouTube channel. It will be archived
the
there.
The YouTube channel.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I see one more
and
question.
Then,
what do you do if one of the employees doesn't want to meet to discuss a disagreement?
Right. Well, that sort of leaves you hanging, doesn't it? It would depend on the situation. I would encourage you probably to consult with someone to match the right intervention with the situation you've got. So sometimes you can meet with that employee another time or two to help understand why they don't want to meet. It may be that they're afraid or have a lack of trust in the other employee, in which case you can take a little bit of time to help them think through what they would say, what they would do. It is true that sometimes employees are not ready to talk to each other, and they need some preparation for that. By the way, the EAP also offers coworker conflict assistance. So you can call and we have a whole protocol for having them work with counselors. Usually they get referred to the same counselor. They each meet with a counselor separately, and then the counselor tries to meet with them together. So that could be one option. In some cases, really what you've got is maybe insubordination. You've got an employee just not willing to cooperate. But I wouldn't jump to that conclusion. If somebody's not open to talking to their coworker, it's probably a lack of trust and probably can be handled from that direction. And remember, we all sort of automatically, when we're feeling unsafe, we automatically have a way of responding, of reacting to that. And often it's retreat, pulling away, withdrawing. And so forcing somebody to sit and meet with another employee is also not a good idea. Okay. Any other questions, Brenda, that you see?
I don't see that we have any more questions for this afternoon.
All righty. Well, thank you all for attending. I hope you got at least one thing out of today that you'll remember. And I'd encourage you to go practice, because practicing is how that will actually instill it in your memory. So think of one thing you learned today and try to go practice it. And thanks for attending. We really appreciate it.